Well, today we are looking at the documents of Vatican II, and we're going to look at the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. It is known by its Latin title, Gaudium et Spes, or Spes. And I'll just get this out of the way up front. That always makes me think of Pez and Pez dispensers. So this council will be a Spes dispenser. And it's, what is Spes? Hope. So if you remember, I guess it's probably a Latin tradition that goes back before the church, but documents will be named after the first few words. And so that's why you have Gaudete Sunday, because that's the first line of the introit, or the Pater Noster, or the Ave Maria, or so on. Well, here, the opening lines of the Constitution are the joys and the hopes. And so it starts out on a positive note. Now it says the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age. So you can only imagine the difference in tone if you had just switched those two terms and started out with the griefs and the anxieties and the joys and the hopes. So then the whole thing would be known as grief and anxiety. But thankfully that's not what we have. I made a mistake in going through these. I should have saved this for last, because I was thinking that it was second to last, but it turns out it's the last, and it's preceded by the document on the church, on ecclesiology. And so it builds out of that, but it's not going to create too much of a hassle or problem for us to look at it before we look at the other. But we should just keep in mind that we've, in the course of the council, already gone through rethinking the church and kind of getting that all squared away and on paper before we reach out to the modern world and try to interact and lay out the groundwork for that. This is a very different kind of document than what we've ever had before. It is uniquely the only document that really originates from the council itself, in the sense that it didn't start out with any preparatory work before the council. So if you remember, when Pope John the 23rd called the council, he got submissions from all over the world of different ideas, topics to be covered, and so on. And the Curia indexed all that and compiled it together and came up with draft documents, and those were just kind of whittled down and whittled down and whittled down. And this was not among them. And ironically, it ends up being by far the longest document to ever come out of any council whatsoever. It's basically a little book. It's like a 100-page book. And it comes from the council floor. So let's see. The immediate impetus for drafting what was to become the Pastoral Constitution, finally promulgated on December 7th, 1965. This is the day, it's either the day before the council ended or the last day of the council. I forget which. It came from a challenging intervention at the close of the first session. And if you remember from our earlier discussion, the first session was really groundbreaking, and that's where all the most momentous things happened, because it charted the course for the rest of it. And when it says intervention, basically this is a speech, a fancy word for speech. So the question asked for more of a statement of the church's sense of identity, of our consciousness of its inner nature. The council, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. The speaker was Cardinal Leon Joseph Suenens from Belgium. And if we hear Belgium, right away, this is coming from the left. And it ends up being a document that is both praised and criticized by both the left and the right. So I wouldn't say it's an entirely just a one-sided partisan type of thing, but that's where it originates from. The Rhine flows into the Tiber. Well, this is definitely coming from the Rhine, but it's also echoing a lot of the thoughts of the Council Fathers, and that's why it ends up being successful and turned into not just its own document, but a pastoral constitution, and the longest one to come out of the council. So he makes his remarks, and it appeals to the progressive majority, of course, first of all, Cardinal Battista Montini, or Giovanni Montini, who later becomes Paul VI, and Cardinal, or Bishop Lercaro signs on. And they want some interaction with the world. The council must speak of the church and what is outside, of how it conceives its relationship to the world today. We've been talking about the church and its self-identity and its realization of its inner workings, but we're in a world that needs to be evangelized. How are we to relate to the outside world, and so on. Some commentators on this particular constitution describe it as sort of the constitution of evangelism, in a certain sense. Not forthrightly so, not obviously so, but in a subtle way. That is, we want to engage the world. And we think about the background of this particular constitution. You're dealing with men who have come out of World War II. So that is 15 years behind them. And they probably lived through World War I, too, as well. And so they are coming into an era of great optimism. And remember, this is, Kennedy has already made his speech, we're going to the moon. The torch has been passed to a new generation. And that was not only the feeling in America, but kind of all over the world, is that we're going out into a new era. The 50s were a time of booming and economic growth and prosperity. And you think about most of these cardinals, they came from all over the world, but most of them came from Europe. Europe was bombed to smithereens, and in the course of that decade had, in a large measure, rebuilt itself. And so it was a tremendous optimism. This is our moment, but we need to seize the day. And in a way, this document is perhaps the most dated of all the documents of Vatican II, except for the liturgical constitution, which focuses on a specific situation in a moment in time. But in other ways, it's not so dated. I mean, it speaks about things that span different moments and cultures, because it talks about very fundamental things like the dignity of the human person and the community of mankind and things like that. But it definitely comes out of a particular era of optimism and engagement. And that is exactly what you find with Pope John the 23rd when he opens the council, that it's time for us to engage with the world and present the gospel in a new way and engage the world because we want to convert the world. And he had phrased it in terms of lumen gentium, the light of the nations, the light of the Gentiles. We need to let that light shine. And it's interesting to see what they put down on paper back then in that optimistic era and how it interacts with our own time in a more pessimistic era. And it's odd also that you have such an optimistic era in the time when you're at the height of the Cold War, really. The 60s is also the time when you have the Bay of Pigs invasion and then the missile crisis and all that, and the Berlin Wall. So it's really odd that you have such an optimistic period at the height of such tension. And in fact, that may be kind of what it's getting at when it opens up by saying the joys and the hopes and the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age. Now, that optimism really, I would say, peaked at the end of the 20th century. So if you remember, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had basically the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and you had, here's a wonderful opportunity, the threat of imminent, not just war, but universal destruction is behind us. Now we can focus on the future and looking forward, and we can build a new world together. We can have a new world order. That phrase resonated out of that time period, the fall of the Berlin Wall and a new community of nations. And it's interesting when I would sew on my vestments, I would put on old stuff to kind of play in the background, occupy my mind. And so I like to go to YouTube and do old political speeches, or for a while I was going through old debates. And so I pulled up the debate between George Bush and Al Gore. And, it's like, time moves on and you kind of forget the things from the past. And it was so interesting to hear them go back and forth talking about this type of subject, the collapse of the Soviet Union and what kind of role should U.S. play in the world and our military. And you forget that Gore was the hawk and Bush was the dove. And so Bush was talking about, no, we got a peace dividend, we got to cut back on military spending, we got to, put our resources in other places. We can't be the policeman of the world. And Gore was no, we need to keep our presence out there in the world's a dangerous place, and so on. And then, of course, after that, you have the attack on the United States by terrorists, and an era of war and an era of gloominess and of tension around the world, that the world is not a less dangerous place, but a much more dangerous place, and one that is perhaps difficult to put our finger on and be able to handle. Because at least back before, you had a balance of power. And, it was comforting to at least have what you know and are familiar with to work with. So we have an optimistic era, and the Council Fathers are trying to engage that. We think about the contemporary discussions about the Benedictine option. So what is the Benedictine option? Well, it comes from this idea that, in the darkness of the Middle Ages, when the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe was overrun with barbarians and so on, it was the monasteries that were kind of walled in as fortresses, and they kept civilization alive, and they had libraries full of all these ancient resources, and they kept up the community of faith. And when the world had settled down on the outside, then they were able to sort of repopulate the intellectual culture and the spiritual culture and so on. And so the Benedictine option is, well, the storms are coming. The storms of culture, the storm of the collapse of Christian culture and so on. And we need to batten down the hatches and draw back into the monastery and just be ourselves and let the world go by in its storm. And when it's over, we can come out again. And I think this is reminding us that we do need to engage with the world, because in a sense, that was the situation that the church was in back in those days. It was, and especially the Catholic Church in places like the United States, where in Europe, it was very familiar and old, but here it was primarily an immigrant community. And even though you had, second, third, fourth generation Catholics all over the place, it was still regarded from the outside, and I think perceived within as a self-identity, as an immigrant community. So, and especially you had your Irish kind of enclaves, and your Irish parishes, and your Polish parishes, and your German parishes, and so on. And that's something also that I think the Catholics themselves were guilty of fostering, perhaps more than they should. Because when you have immigrant groups come over, it's natural to want to gravitate to your own and find safety in your own people, but you don't want to do that so much that you end up being a ghetto. And so I think about back in Milwaukee, and when we went on a church tour, and it's like we went to the German church, and we went to the Polish church, and you could see kind of all these subtle distinctions and influences between the different ethnic groups that migrated to the United States. So they had gotten very kind of built in a fortress with the culture. It was a time of triumphalism, but it was also a time of us versus them. And the feeling in the council was, no, we need to engage with the outside world. We need to be the light to the nations. We need to not take this Benedictine option at this time, We need to open up. Now is the time for opening up. In hindsight, in retrospect, was that the right call? I don't know. Because you think about, well, what is the alternative? Would that have been any better? I don't know. I think the storm was coming, whether we opened up or held in or not. The difficulty was when you open the door, when you open the window, that hole allows things to move both ways. And so the image of Pope John the 23rd was, we want to open up the window and let the fresh air come in. Well, the nasty air can come in too. So there's a difficulty in that. And in fact, I was listening to a talk on Gaudium et Spes, and Karl Barth, who was, of course, watching the council very closely and was encouraged by it. And I thought that, of all the churches in the world at that time, the Holy Spirit was really doing something there. But he also had his own criticism, and he had a visit with the Pope toward the end of the council. And he talked about, this aggiornamento, this updating that we've been talking about here. How do you know when that's done? How do you know when you've updated enough? And it was kind of a rhetorical question, because it simply served to point out that, this is something that can come back to bite you in the end, because you may let in more than you bargained for. And I think that was the case, because you can't really you can't control these kinds of things. It's like you can't control air, and you can't control seawater. It will go where it wants to go, and you can't stop it. Once you open up that hole, it will go where it wants to. Well, let's get into the document. It's basically set up in two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is kind of the theology part, and part 2 is more the kind of practical application part. So part 1 is called The Church and Man's Calling, and part 2 is called Some Problems of Special Urgency. And this is the only document that's called the Pastoral Constitution. The one on the liturgy is just called the Constitution, and then the other two are dogmatic constitutions, and this is called a Pastoral Constitution, because the other two are, they're just more straightforwardly doctrinal. But this one tries to be kind of half and half. Here's the doctrine, here's how it might start to fit in with some of these current problems that we see today. Let's look at the opening preface. And in all of these documents, the preface, the introduction, is very important, because that really lays out all of the things that it wants to cover and say, and the perspective that it's coming from, and the goal that it wants to achieve, and so on. So it goes like this. The Gaudium et Spes, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. I thought that was a great opening, and it's been widely regarded as a wonderful opening thought. We want to engage the world, and hey, you out there, your joys and your problems, they're the same things we experience too. And we want to compare notes and share resources because we think we have something to offer. Makes sense. And that's very much in line with Pope John the 23rd and his desire to engage the world and be a light to the nations and so on. It continues, indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts, for theirs is a community composed of men. United in Christ, it's odd because it talks about us, the church, as they. Yeah. So it's almost like it's stepping outside of the church and, buddying up to the non-church and saying, hey, these guys, they're like you. They're struggling with the same problems, and they have a resource that you might be interested in. So theirs is a community composed of men. United in Christ, they are led by the Holy Spirit in their journey to the kingdom of their Father, and they have welcomed the news of salvation, which is meant for every man. Hey, you too. That is why this community realizes that it is fully linked with mankind and its history by the deepest of bonds. Paragraph 2. Well, these paragraph numbers, most of them are more than one paragraph. So I'll say paragraph number, but they can be multiple paragraphs. Number 2, hence this Second Vatican Council, having probed more profoundly into the mystery of the Church, now addresses itself without hesitation not only to the sons of the Church and to all who invoke the name of Christ, but to the whole of humanity. For the Council yearns. Have you ever yearned?
No, sure.
Everybody yearns. But the Council yearns to explain to everyone how it conceives of the presence and activity of the Church in the world of today. Therefore, so this is wanting to open up a dialogue. Therefore, the Council focuses its attention on the world of men, the whole human family, along with the sum of those realities in the midst of which it lives. That world of which is the theater of man's history and the air of his energies, his tragedies, and his triumphs. That world which the Christian sees as created and sustained by its Maker's love, fallen indeed into the bondage of sin, yet emancipated now by Christ, who was crucified and rose again to break the stranglehold of personified evil, so that the world might be fashioned anew according to God's design and reach its full fulfillment. Number 3. Though mankind is stricken with wonder at his own discoveries and its power, remember this is the atomic age, it often raises anxious questions about the current trend of the world, about the place and role of man in the universe, about the meaning of its individual and collective strivings, and about the ultimate destiny of reality and humanity. Hence, giving witness and voice to the faith of the whole people of God gathered together by Christ, this council can provide no more eloquent proof of its solidarity with, as well as its respect and love for the entire human family, with which it is bound up, than by engaging with it in conversation about these various problems. So we don't want to go it alone, and we don't want you guys to go it alone. Let's help each other. Let's be two beggars helping each other to find out where to get some bread. So this council brings to mankind light kindled from the gospel and puts at its disposal those saving resources which the Church herself, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, receives from her founder. So this is something we talked about in the sermon today. You know, God gives tremendous gifts to his Church, but they're not meant for us. They're given to us in order for us to distribute to others or to live out for the benefit of others. For the human person deserves to be preserved. Human society deserves to be renewed. Hence, the focal point of our total presentation will be man himself, whole and entire, body and soul, heart and conscience, mind and will. Therefore, this sacred synod, proclaiming the noble destiny of man and championing the godlike seed which has been sown in him, offers to mankind the honest assistance of the Church in fostering that brotherhood of all men which corresponds to this destiny of theirs. Inspired by no earthly ambition, the Church seeks but a solitary goal to carry forward the work of Christ under the lead of the befriending Spirit. And Christ entered this world to give witness to the truth, to rescue and not to sit in judgment, to serve and not to be served. So that's the introduction. Some of the difficulties of it is that more than any other, and as mentioned, this is the longest document, it bears really the signs of that kind of being written by a committee. It just kind of goes on and on and on sometimes. And it would have been, I think, much more effective and powerful if it had been only half the length at the longest and had more of a single author than kind of this composition by committee. And that's also probably a sign of its origin, where it was the one that came out of the council itself, rather than having been kind of worked over by a preparatory committee before the council began and been given kind of a coherent shape before it kind of got into the hands of the committee that was supposed to put it together. Another thing is that you see perhaps a little bit too much of Enlightenment language coming in here, the kind of Freemasonic, French Revolution types of ideas. And it's almost like it's kind of playing footsie with that. It's like, oh, we too have an idea of universal brotherhood. It's a little bit different from yours, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Ours is based on God's creation and the Holy Spirit and so on. But yeah, we both have this idea of universal brotherhood, so let's get together and let's be brothers, And the difficulty is it doesn't distinguish as much as perhaps it should. So it ends up kind of giving the wrong impression at times about where these concepts and values and ideas come from. Also, one of the difficulties of it being so long is that a lot of people look to it for inspiration and guidance without reading it. So it ends up becoming like a bill that goes through Congress that nobody reads, but it affects everybody, And it also ends up being like one of the things that is the most attached to, the spirit of Vatican II kind of thing, where people invoke it, but they don't actually study it and read it. It just kind of sits there as an excuse, So it has its problems. Also, one of the things that is a difficulty is that although it does stress sin, it does stress grace, it even mentions the devil, it ends up coming off or giving the impression of being too, we're all good guys and we're beyond this problem of sin now. We just need to get along. And so one of its big critics at the time was one of the council theologians, the Periti, named Joseph Ratzinger. That might ring a bell. And his big criticism was that it's too Pelagian. That is, it's too, not relying on God's grace, but we can do it on our own. We can, it's a brave new world. Let's hold hands and we'll get this done. I think that's a good criticism. It definitely finds its plenty of rebuttal in the document. But again, the problem is who goes in and reads this long document that has its moments, but also is monotonous and drones on, and it's just not a good bedtime read. One of the best lines comes right after this introduction, and it's almost like if they had started with this, that might have set a better tone. So this subheading is introductory statement of the situation of men in the modern world. And so this is paragraph 4. To carry out such a task, of engaging the modern world, the Church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. And I think that's a much better idea to launch out with than some of the stuff that was in the introduction, the preface. And so we want to engage with the outside world, but realize that our perspective has always been to look at the lay of the land and to analyze it through a particular lens, the light of the gospel, see it that way. You may not see it that way, but that's how we see it. And we think that our perspective has a value that you can learn to appreciate as well. That's why we're opening the door. That's why we want to engage with you in the world outside. Let me go back to the sort of table of contents here. Part 1, we'll talk about the dignity of the human person. So remember, part 1 is kind of the theological part. Part 2 is the application part. The dignity of the human person, the community of mankind. What do we mean by the brotherhood of man? What is our perspective and idea about that? Man's activity throughout the world and the role of the church in the modern world. Those are all part of the theological segment. And then part 2, we get into, the title is Some Problems of Special Urgency. And so it's not an exhaustive list, but it's, these are the big ones that we think we might start with. The dignity of marriage and the family. That definitely hit on a spot because things were really beginning to evolve in terms of the family dynamic and cultural trends and so on, and that would only get progressively more intense, I would say worse, as time went on. proper development of culture, economic and social life. It's interesting that this document really pulls together a lot of the papal encyclicals from the time of Pope Leo XIII in the 1800s to modern day, all up to Paul VI. And it kind of brings in those elements of the church trying to comment on political trends and cultural trends and talk about. So, for example, Pope Leo XIII condemned Americanism. I can't give you a good, solid, quick, and easy definition on what that means, but a lot of it was our tendency to be too individualistic, our tendency to not take in more the social concerns of Europe. And then on the other side, he also, while condemning socialism, condemning, of course, communism that came later on, but condemning this kind of government heavy-handedness, also recognized that, workers have rights. They have the right to collective bargaining. They have, a right to the government to step in and come up with safety standards and, working hours and all kinds of things that we see in the labor movement and the socialist kind of interests. Some of these things were given the green light. Some of these things were warned against. And so it tries to collect all of these comments and ideas that have come out of the popes commenting on these developments as they went along and bring them into a kind of synthesis. So that's what it basically looks at when we get to the section on economic and social life, and as well as the life of a political community. It's also kind of it perhaps makes the biggest contribution to new ideas and teaching coming out of the council when it gets to the political community. Because this is really the first time in a big way that the church has been open to the idea of democracy. Democracy was sort of looked at as kind of an oddball thing. It'll never catch on. It's just a flash in the pan. The church was basically still used to the concept of monarchy, and we'll just deal with the one guy, and that's the easiest and quickest and simplest form of government. So the church doesn't have a particular doctrine about this is the God-given legitimate form of government. It has certain parameters about rights and responsibilities and so on. And so within those parameters, you can have any kind of setup that you want. And so this is really the first time that it kind of opens up to the reality of democracy and comments on it and talks about, these are the parameters of an appropriate democratic government. And then it closes up with a segment on trying to foster peace and a promotion of a community of nations, basically dealing with the reality of the Cold War and of nuclear proliferation and all of those kinds of things that are very much a sign of the times. And in fact, speaking of sign of the times, in paragraph 4, the church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times. And that was really a catchphrase of that era, the signs of the times. You think modern man. And this idea that modern man is kind of a new man. We got a new man coming here. We got a new reality. We got a new world. We got a new culture. Everything's new. And it was always a good thing. It was very rarely a bad thing. Like, oh my gosh, we got this new world coming in here. We got this technology. We got a new man for the modern era. People weren't like that. They were thinking, this is all wonderful. But they introduce a little bit of critical eye here. Our duty is to scrutinize the signs of the times and to interpret them in the light of the gospel. Well, let's go on to a few practical applications in terms of what they have to say. In the section on the dignity of man, of course, they focus a lot on Imago Dei. Man was created in God's image. That is where the essential dignity of man really comes from, is that we are made by God to be like him and to have fellowship with him. And this is all humanity, not just us, but you outside there too. We want to help you realize that and, bring that to fruition, restore that. But they also give a lot of attention to conscience. And this is where the influence of John Henry Newman comes to light, because conscience was a big thing for him, and a lot of his devotees are really bringing those elements into the mix here. So, for example, in paragraph 16, they get into conscience. In the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience. So it's talking about, kind of dovetailing out of that imago Dei. Every person on the inside, in their sphere of conscience, has this moral sense that's embedded, encoded by God into our very being. We don't always handle it very well, but it's there. It's also what we call natural law. Always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The void of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. In a wonderful manner, conscience reveals that law, which is fulfilled by love of God and neighbor. In fidelity to conscience, Christians are joined with the rest of men in the search for truth and for the genuine solution to the numerous problems which arise in the life of individuals from social relationships. You can see how it kind of starts good and then it starts to kind of drone on, and it's like, you had me, but now you've lost me because my eyes are glazing over and I'm losing you. And if it cut out a lot of this stuff and been a lot shorter, it would have been a lot more effective, because they come back to a good point. Because the difficulty is when you bring up conscience, well, that's where real decision making takes place, and we're all drawn toward doing good and shunning evil, and God is the voice that's beckoning us this way. But what about sin? There's this other element at war in our conscience. What about forming your conscience, learning right and wrong, so we have a true voice speaking to us, and it's not just our own self-deception? Because as Jeremiah said, the heart is deceitful above all, desperately corrupt and wicked. Who can understand it? So it says, in fidelity to conscience, Christians are joined with the rest of men in the search for truth and for the genuine solution to numerous problems which arise in the life of individuals from social relationships. Hence, the more right conscience holds sway, the more persons and groups turn aside from blind choice and strive to be guided by the objective norms of morality. So then it starts to kind of go back toward, well, we need to form our conscience. We need to inject some light of truth in there so it can be strengthened and equipped. The same cannot be said for a man who cares but little for truth and goodness, or for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. So there we see, yeah. So there we see the criticisms of people like Ratzinger. It's like, well, it's good, but you kind of lose sight of all of this, the dark side of these things. You tend to focus so much on the generosity and the happiness and the goodness and so on. You lose sight of the dangers inherent and the problems of sin and so on. Let's touch briefly on, they mention atheism a lot. And here you see the influence of a man named Karol Wojtyła, who becomes, of course, Pope John Paul II. And, of course, he is coming from the communist bloc, so he is surrounded by atheists, militant atheists. And he says, I know John the 23rd made this deal, we can't condemn communism, but we need to say something about atheism, because this is very much a reality in the world that some of us are dealing with more than others, but all of us are going to have to deal with to some extent or another. And also, it's a problem that we, in a sense, created. You know, the church, her problems, birthed this situation. There wouldn't be any atheists if it wasn't for sin within the church, basically. Now, of course, you know, atheist ideas really come out of Schopenhauer and other philosophers, but nevertheless, it's the faults of the church that lead to the rise of atheism and its respectability and its cohesion as a system. And so they spend some time talking about atheism and wanting to engage with those who may not believe in God, but have at least a commitment of goodwill. Let's also go down, we're almost out of time here, and touch a little bit on the marriage and family part, because they have really insightful things to say when we get to the application. Talking about the dignity of the human family. The intimate part, this is paragraph 48. The intimate partnership of married life and love has been established by the Creator and qualified by his laws, and is rooted in the conjugal covenant of irrevocable personal consent. Hence, by that human act whereby spouses mutually bestow and accept each other, a relationship arises, which by divine will, and in the eyes of society too, is a lasting one. For the good of the spouses and their offsprings, as well as of society, the existence of the sacred bond no longer depends on human decisions alone. That is, let no man put asunder. It's there, you can't destroy it. For God himself is the author of matrimony, endowed it as it is with various benefits and purposes. And of course, it talks about the purpose being procreation of children. It doesn't, it gets a little bit away from the old perspective of that's basically the only purpose. The only purpose of marriage is just to have kids and produce the next generation. It also talks about the importance of the unitive aspect that, part of having a secure home and a strong home is that you have two parents who love each other. And this is one of the things that helps kind of keep them engaged and loving one another. And it has its own value in the marriage life. And they get into sort of issues of conjugal responsibility. They talk about, they touch a little bit on birth control and on abortion. I think that's in paragraph 63 or so. That's another one of, no, maybe not that far down. It's another one of the consequences of such a large document. It's like, where is this part? It just gets lost in the sea of words. Here we go. This is paragraph 51. So it says the council realizes that modern conditions are often problematic for couples in terms of, providing for a number of children and how many children they're going to have, and also of, we really can't afford another child, so we better back off and not, do the marriage act. But that has its own difficulty of couples kind of going their separate ways and growing apart. It says, to these problems, there are those who presume to offer dishonorable solutions, in other words, contraception. Indeed, they do not recoil even from the taking of life, abortion. But the Church issues the reminder that a true contradiction cannot exist between the divine laws pertaining to the transmission of life and those pertaining to authentic conjugal love. For God, the Lord of life, has conferred on men the surpassing ministry of safeguarding life in a manner which is worthy of man. Therefore, from the moment of its conception, life must be guarded with the greatest care, while abortion and infanticide are unspeakable crimes. And so it will comment just a little bit about abortion and about birth control, but it won't go in depths, and that is by design. there was some question about, how much should we say about this? And it was decided by Pope Paul VI. Just kind of touch on it a little bit and while you're addressing all these other problems. But we'll kind of pull this issue out and put it over here because it's already being studied by a commission that is doing research on, some of these new technological developments, and we'll have a fuller statement on that later on. That ends up being, of course, Humanae Vitae. And it was also complicated by these new technologies. So I believe the pill was developed by a Catholic doctor with the specific idea that, well, here perhaps is a natural solution to this situation that can, work within the moral boundaries and so on. And that needed some time to kind of be looked at and analyzed and digested and responded to. And so the document here doesn't go into depths on that, but that is, as I said, by design. And then, of course, abortion would be covered more extensively when you get to John Paul II with Veritatis Splendor and the whole kind of moral, almost textbook that he wrote on that. And the Gospel of Life, of course, touches a lot upon those things. Well, I guess we'll sort of wrap it up there. They talk again as well about problems of, culture and of organization of governments, socialism and political theories and rights and responsibilities and nuclear proliferation and things like that. But that is Gaudium et Spes, the hopes and the joys, as well as the anxieties and the fears of modern man are shared by those within the church as well. So, world, let's talk about it and see if we can pass on some of our light that we get from God in dealing with these matters. Be two poor beggars trying to help each other find some bread. All right, thank you.